Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we're back. We're going to talk about how to fix a lot of the issues in America. I listed them and went into a brief explanation on how I would address some of them. And we're going to talk about the heavily affected areas, Flint, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, and Ferguson, Missouri. How I would go about fixing those places, and just generally what messed them up to begin with. Um, the thing about Flint, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, and Ferguson, Missouri is they're very steeped in gun violence, which is something that I talked about on the last episode. It's very steeped in problems, I guess, associated with government. It's very steeped in racial unrest. And, as I told you before, if you were listening, really the problem with all of the United States are those three issues. You have a corrupt police force, you have government officials who won't make sure that crimes committed by police are tried effectively. You have a problem, and that's especially true in Ferguson and Flint. Um, you have a problem with gun violence in each and every place that I listed, and that problem isn't just automatic weapons, it's guns in the hands of people who shouldn't have them, unregistered guns. It's it's pretty out of control in those places because quite frankly once they got so bad, people stopped really paying attention. People didn't allow themselves to, I guess, hone in on the problems. They just reacted to them. They didn't address them. As far as Ferguson, Missouri, that's a place that's seen a lot of police brutality. That's a place that's seen a lot of, I guess, political troubles because anytime you have a police brutality case and that case doesn't get tried effectively, it's not just a problem with the police force, it's not just a problem with the prosecution, it's a problem with government officials who don't make sure those people do their jobs because then ultimately the government is responsible for the prosecutors and also the appointment of police chiefs and things like that. And I think that when you really examine the issues in Ferguson, Missouri, the racial unrest there all stems from the government not doing its job. I believe that if the place was cleaner, if a lot of the crimes didn't take place there unresolved, I believe that if guns were handled correctly, you wouldn't have a big problem in Ferguson, Missouri. You would just have, you know, I guess an underprivileged place that would need, some work to get on the right path, but it would be something, more, I guess, close to the American standard. And I think that that place right now is substandard. I believe that we need to address it as a country, not just the people in Missouri, but I believe all over the country we need to understand that these places like Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Maryland, places like that where the murder rates are so high, where the level of gun violence is so high, we need to look at them and not ask ourselves how it got there, but ask ourselves what can we do to fix it. And I think that in Chicago especially, it's a place where at one time especially, you know, in certain neighborhoods. Chicago was an amazing place to live. Michael Jordan had his heyday in Chicago, was a member of the Chicago Bulls, Chicago Cubs, White Sox. They all do business in Chicago. How did it become Chirac? I believe everything in America, as I said, can be looked at as, is the government doing its job? Are the people able to get along? White, black, Hispanic, Muslim, Israeli, everyone. Is everyone able to get along? And how are they combating guns in the wrong hands? If you check off all those boxes and you say that they're at least doing something about all those things, then I believe you have a decent place to live. If you look at other places in the United States, while the gun violence may be high, they're addressing it. While races may not be getting along, while there may be hate crimes and things like that, they're addressing it. While the government may have, you know, substandard dealings, while they may be, big time corruption cases and things like that happening within the government, they're being addressed. Those things are being rooted out in other places in the country. And in Chicago, Illinois, Flint, Michigan, and Ferguson, Missouri, they're really not being addressed. And I think that's how they got there. And I think that's how they get themselves out of the hole. I think if you really address those three issues, the rest will kind of work itself out. And I believe that people don't examine those three issues enough in this country. I think that when you really stop and examine the way that people interact with each other in a place like New York, which is where I'm from, there's all kinds of people here, from Asian, Muslim, you know, Hispanic, white, black, and everything in between, but we don't have as much hate crime as some other places. In fact, we have, I would say, very little in comparison to most places who don't have that kind of diversity. And the reason for that is because of the diversity. We're used to seeing Guyanese around the corner. We're used to seeing Muslims somewhere around. We're used to seeing Asians somewhere around us. And I think when you're used to seeing all these different people, you're exposed to their cultures, you understand that while we are different, we're all the same. You know, the thing that I really don't like is racism, when it's the type of racism not just that physically imposes itself on people, but that oppresses people. Meaning, well, I'm not going to hire a person of color. I'm not going to hire anyone but my people because that's what I want to do. That's the kind of racism that really scars America. And that's what you really don't see a ton of in New York, in California, in the bigger metropolitan areas where there's a lot of those different people other than just white and black, because white and black really make up the majority of the United States, I guess. And as long as there are other types of people and we're getting exposed to these things, we're more able to deal with it. We're more able to deal with the differences. We're more able to be a part of each other's cultures. You know, I can't tell you how fun it is for me to talk to people online about what they eat for dinner. It's a really simple thing, but when you think about it, it can be a cultural experience. I know people from the Philippines, I know people from Ireland. I know people from all kinds of places. And when I ask them what they had for dinner, it tells me something about them. It tells me where they are in the world is a little different than where I am, but you know what? They have something unique to bring to the table, literally and figuratively, that my family and the people that I hang around don't. And I think that if you had just Caucasian Americans or just, whites as a race or just blacks as a race, the world would be a very boring place because you wouldn't be able to experience other cultures. Imagine your world without Chinese food, Indian food. Imagine your life without uh, Japanese food, without sushi, without a lot of the things that we enjoy in America because that's what it would be like if these races weren't here. I think that that's the type of thing that America needs to understand and get used to appreciating about each other instead of just arguing with each other about our differences. I think when you stop and think, and I'm going to go back to the situation in Flint, Michigan now with the drinking water and the things of that nature that aren't where they should be. I think first you have to address education, which is something I didn't bring up in the other places. Education there needs to be brought up to standards. Because once you are able to educate people, once people feel like there's a way out, then I believe you will see businesses return there because the level of productivity will go up. You know, education, and this is something that resonated in me and something that Bernie Sanders said, education should be a right and not a privilege. And it's because every person deserves an opportunity to learn. One of the most tragic things to me about the slavery days was that African Americans weren't allowed to read and write. They weren't allowed to have any type of intellectual stimulation because if they did, they feared an uprising. And that creates the problems that we have now because, as I stated before, we just as a people, we don't have power. The Rockefellers were coming up during the days where African Americans were fighting for rights. There's lots of the Fords were coming up in a time where there was still slavery. And it's because of those things that we have to play catch up. And that's very hard to do in America right now because we don't hold any of the cards. And that goes for all the races, maybe not slavery for all the different races, but those other races, the Hispanics, the Asians, didn't have footholds in America. And it's because of that that they're behind in the schedule. They're behind in the rate that at which they should be growing. And that's a problem for all minorities in America. And that's why having the governmental power to change things, having the ability to create opportunities for your own community is something that we need. And I don't mean just your own race in that community. I mean your community, the people you live around and near and with. Being able to create opportunities for them would be huge, and it's something that we desperately need in America. Different cultures need to be able to create opportunities for not only their own culture but the people that they're around because quite frankly, if you see a place in America, in Texas, in California, in New York, where there are mostly Asians, they're still being governed by Caucasians. And that isn't really supposed to happen. We're going to talk about a couple more things in the next episode. We're going to go on break right now.